go. Sweet. So, welcome to this live stream. I tried to do this once and I messed it up. But for those of you just starting to watch, basically the contents of this live stream are going to be focused around how to create a web application using a React frontend and a Spring Boot, in other words, a Java backend. So nothing crazy here. I'm going to use Visual Studio Code as well as Eclipse. I use Eclipse because it's free. A lot of people are upset when you use Eclipse as for examples, but a lot of people don't have hundreds and hundreds of dollars to invest in something like IntelliJ, so I use Eclipse. In any case, I'm just going to get things started here. So if the concept of building again, this is it's a to-do application, so it's not, again, the sexiest of applications that you can build, but I'm going to be using real-world code. So I'm going to pretend like I was actually tasked with building this application for a client, an actual customer. So I'm going to, do my best to make it as good as possible, to follow standard coding conventions. Because in a lot of example tutorials you see, they don't exactly have what I would call production ready code. So I'm going to try my best to do what I can to make it quote unquote production ready. So if that excites you, if that's something that you would love to see in other videos, go ahead and click the like button in this. That's how, the YouTube algorithm, it's all knowing and all encompassing. We must appease the YouTube algorithm. So please do click the like button if the concept of building an app from scratch using React and Spring as close to real world as possible is exciting to you. Click the like button. Cool. If you have questions along the way, post them in the comments. I try my best to answer them all as we go. Otherwise, let's get started. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a little shell window here. I'm going to create a new directory called, to-do app. How about that? Nothing crazy. I'll go into it and we can get started. Now, if you've never built a React front-end application before, because maybe you're familiar with Java, but you've never coded one yourself, let me just fix my little camera here, then you may not be familiar with this. So as long as you have two things, you need NPM. I'm using NPM version 6.14.8. So this is the Node package manager. You can download this from Google. I'm not going to show you that stuff, but you can go download the Node package manager. It actually comes with Node, so Node.js. We're not going to be using Node.js specifically, but we're using React, and it sort of comes as part of the Node package manager. I also have Node installed, which is version 12 at the moment of this recording. So, you just sort of need those two things before you can get going. You just, Google how to install Node on my computer, and you'll get an explanation. Once you have those installed and up to date, you use npx with the command create React app, and then you tell it what the name of the app should be. So I'll call it to-do app. And that's it. That will run for a couple minutes. So while this is running, I get to chit-chat and waste a little bit of time. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to actually jump over to the installation of the other side, the Spring Boot application. So in terms of the React, we'll let that go, and let's flip back over to the Eclipse world. So in Eclipse, I have installed, I went to help, and I went to the Eclipse marketplace, and I actually installed a little application or a little plugin here. You look for Spring Tools, and when you here Spring Tools 4, you install Spring Tools 4, and what that does is it allows you to easily create Spring Boot applications inside of your Eclipse environment. In other words, you can do this: File, New, and you can go to where is it? Other, and then Spring Boot. It gives you a Spring Boot folder, and inside of the Spring Boot folder, you can do Spring Starter Project. So we fire up the Spring Starter Project, which just means a Spring Boot app. I don't know why they wouldn't call that, Spring Boot Project, but anyway, who am I to criticize? So we'll call this a to-do app. I don't know, fair enough. So I'm going to use, Maven, packaging as a jar, Java 11. We could use Java 15. I just haven't read up on all the Java 15 stuff, and I'm sure there's useful stuff in there, but even that in the real world, typically right now, the most popular version is still 8. So if you're using 11, then you're ahead of the game. Using it with Java, and we'll call this, the group name. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because this is kind of like the nitty gritty. And we'll call this the, to-do app. And the package will be not demo coders campus dot to do app. Sure. And we'll say next. Again, as we're going along, if you have questions or something, feel free to leave them in the comments. So what we're doing here, let me explain. Spring Boot allows you to get up and running quickly with a Java application, a Java web application. So how we can do this here is we can choose something called Spring Web. Spring Web allows you to use something called Spring MVC, which allows you to use Java as a RESTful server, a RESTful endpoint, a sort of a headless server. And what that means is we have a client-side app, which is the React app that it's currently building itself. And it's done. There you go. Cool. So we've created the React front end, and the React front end will call and talk to the Java backend. So that's done via Spring Web. If we wanted to, we could add a database in as well, but I don't think we're going to have time for that. Otherwise, that'll make it a bit of a longer video. So we'll do Spring Web, and we'll just sort of imitate a database. And then we say finish. Cool. Also, as I've been talking for a little bit, if you are watching this and for some reason something's wrong, let me know in the comments. But if you can hear me, if everything's good, I'm coming through, clear. Maybe not loud. I know my microphone is not loud, but if you can hear me clearly, let me know in the comments that everything is okay. I'd hate to be talking to no one. So, let's see. We've got this created now. So, boom, we already have a little backend, a little Spring Boot application up and running. If we wanted to, we can click here, right-click on the actual application that it created and say run it as a Spring Boot app, and we can actually see it boot up here in the console window, and it says started the to-do application. So there you go. We already have a little, application started. But let's flip over to the front-end code, which is this one, where we created the code in the to-do, or we created the to-do app with a React, the npx create React app to-do app. Okay, so let's open that up. The React front-end, we'll open that up using Visual Studio Code, which is going to be a nice big font. If you're watching on a mobile phone or something, you'll be able to see this clearly. We'll open a folder, and the folder will be not demo app, but to-do app or something? To-do app. And we'll open the to-do app folder, say select, and then beautiful. It will have all these folders and files coming in. We can, thank you for letting me know that you can hear me. We can open up the source. So I know I'm going kind of quickly here, but this stuff you can find tutorials on this stuff everywhere, and I don't want to get too far into the nitty gritty until we actually get into the real, the good code. So the main part of a React app is the app.js file. This is where there's a little bit of code that starts us off. You can run this code by doing an npm start. I typically just open up a terminal here. I say new terminal from the terminal dropdown, and that's where I can just do npm start here. So that fires up the essentially the front end server, if you will, front end development server, and then over here it opens up automatically. It opens up a little browser pointing to localhost 3000. So your front end code is essentially hosted in localhost 3000. If you have familiarity with the Java language and Java server code and whatnot, you'll be used to localhost 8080 is a typical server that you get on the Java side. So React uses 3000. Java servers use 8080. Cool. So what can we do here? What can we do with React? If you've never seen React before, you might be saying, okay, this kind of looks like HTML, right? There's kind of some HTML stuff, but there's functions and there's HTML inside of functions. Like what's happening here? So what the beauty of React, what React gives to you is the ability to more or less write HTML looking tags. However, it's not actually HTML, it's something called JSX, JavaScript extensible language. I actually don't even know what that stands for. But it allows you to write sort of an HTML-esque code, which is very close to HTML. So you'll notice class names, header will be familiar to you, p tags if you've ever used HTML in this stuff, image tags. This is all very, easy stuff, right? So we could delete all this, and instead of saying return all that stuff, we could say return a div that says hi there, right? And hit save. We flip over to our window here and it says hi there, right? So in terms of front-end code, it's pretty straightforward in terms of what happens with React. Important things to remember with React is this is a single page application. So everything that you see here, the whole process of creating the application and clicking around, navigating to different views and all that stuff, it all loads in one file, the index.html file. So everything comes into here. All it does is it loads up the HTML file, and anytime you're clicking around and stuff, it just re-renders the HTML file. It re-renders based on reacting to changes in essentially the document object model, the DOM. There's some more complexity there, but you don't really need to dive into that. So yeah, that's what it's all about. Is it reacts to changes and then re-renders into this one index.html file whenever there's a change. So it gives you the illusion that there's multiple pages in the app, but it's really just one page. It's really just index.html. So let's get into a whole bunch of things. Let's, for now, pause our talk on React. Let's flip over to the Tomcat side, on the Java side, and let's create a controller. Okay, hopefully you know what a controller is. If not, I can give you a brief definition here. Controllers are what listen to essentially events coming in. They're not events, they listen to requests coming in. So how the web works is if you go to google.com and say enter, what it does is that issues an HTTP GET request. And there are essentially 4 different HTTP requests that are sort of the most common: get, post, put, and delete. Those 4 kind of correlate with the concept of CRUD, creating, reading, updating, and deleting data, which is pretty much all we do on a day-to-day basis as programmers. Question: I really like your videos. Help me a good bit to clear some of my Java concepts. Will be well, I think what you're asking is, so cool, glad I could help. The other person question, I think you're saying, is this recording going to be available? And yes, it's going to be available on my channel. So controllers are all about listening to requests coming in from the web. So when React sends a request, in other words, it sends a GET request saying I want to load this page, or if it sends a post request saying I want to submit a form or what have you, that's how they communicate, and the controller will listen for that. Okay. Typically controllers, we put them in a package called web. So that's why it appears here in todoapp.web. If you can't see that because you're on a mobile phone, maybe you want to switch from your mobile phone, but this is a package called Coders Campus todoapp.web. All a package is essentially just it's a folder. That's all it is. It's how you can organize your files. So, all right, take a drink. Take a breath. So we've created a class called toDoController, but in order for it to do anything, to be magical and to actually work like a controller, we're going to use an annotation. So annotations are like little, do they call it syntactical sugar? It's just a little bit of usually one-liner pieces of code that really unlock a lot of cool functionality for your classes. There's one called REST controller, and I'll do Control-Shift-O to import it automatically. This comes from Spring Framework. So this is what allows you to make this a REST controller. What is a REST controller? It's essentially, like I said, it's this thing that listens for incoming requests, and when it gets one, it does stuff with that request. It gets some data, creates new data, modifies data, deletes data, CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. Does something with data, and then sends a response. And when it sends a response, that response is essentially an object or an array of objects or what have you. It's essentially it's an object, right? It becomes it gets translated into text, which is in the form of JSON, JavaScript object notation. Typically, you can also turn it into XML or what have you, but JSON is the most popular one. So in other words, it becomes a universal language. That's what that's how systems can talk to each other across the internet. That's how you have a Python application that can talk to a Java application that can talk to a C# and a C++ and a this and a that. They use a universal language called JSON. Previously, it was XML, but JSON is the new hotness. So that's what a REST controller does. Okay. The difference between that and a regular controller, if you know what a regular controller is, just plain old controller, what that does, it doesn't return an object per se. It returns a view. Okay, which kind of tightly couples it with your front end, which is fine if you want to build it that way, you can. But the more generic and universal way is to create a REST controller. Cool. So now what I'll do is, now that we've defined as a REST controller, let's have it listen. Let's have it listen to a get mapping endpoint, and the get mapping endpoint will have it say, I don't know, /API / to do items, for instance. So in other words, when the React app sends a GET request to localhost 8080, because this REST controller will be hosted on http://localhost 8080, because that's how it's hosted on my computer. It's going to send a request to http localhost 8080 /API / to do items. What this essentially is doing is, this is equivalent of saying fetch all to-do items, probably from database. But we're not going to have time to do an entire database in this. But it's actually not that much more complex to implement a database. But anyway, let's create, this get mapping is tied to a method that I haven't written yet. My apologies. Let me write that method. It's going to return something called a response entity. I'll talk about what that is in a second. And this is going to say, fetch all to-do items. That name doesn't matter. It's just a good name for a method. Cool. So we want to get all the to-do items, essentially, from the database. But right now we don't have any to-do items, so what am I even going to fetch? Well, we need to create some. But first, Control-Shift-O will import those things that were underlined in red. Okay. Again, I will talk about response entity when we're we'll circle back to what that is and what's going on. So get all the to-do items, but we don't have any to-do items. Okay. So like I said at the beginning of this, I want to code this application kind of like exactly like I would do it in the real world if I was tasked to create this as a real application. So I'm going to try not to cut corners here for you guys. How would I do this? So typically we have this format when it comes to the Java side of things. Typically an HTTP request comes in from the front end. So this is front end. There's an HTTP request that comes in and it hits a controller on the, we'll call this the Java server. Like this. Okay, hits a controller. The controller then typically takes that information that it gets and executes code in a service. Okay, and then typically services also talk to do stuff and then talk to repositories. And then the repository sends data back to, this is going to be hard to do, the service. Like this, and then I'll have to do it backwards, and then the service sends that data back to the controller, and then the controller, I think you get the idea of what we're going for, sends the data back to essentially the front end, right? So that's sort of the life cycle of a request. Comes in, gets intercepted by a controller or listened to by a controller. The controller executes a service, which calls a repository, which then sends the data back to the service, which sends data back to the controller, which then sends data back to the front end. Okay, that's the sort of life cycle of what we're dealing with. So this is how you want it. You want to have code as controllers. You want to have service code, and you want to have repository code. Okay. What code goes where? The code that goes into a controller is essentially just, usually it's fairly simple. We receive a request and we execute a service, and then we take the data from the service and send it to the front end. So the controller's responsibility is typically just invoke a service, and then if the service gives us data back, send that data back to the front end. Call a service, send it away. That's essentially all a controller does. So since this is a controller, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to call a service. So what service should we call? Let's create a to-do service. So let's go ahead and create a new class called to-do service. And again, feel free to ask more questions if any come up. I know I'm going pretty quick here because there's only so much, detail you can get into on a live stream that, unless I was doing like a 6-hour live stream, then, but no, my son's going to be home and, shortly, and then I just decided to get a live stream out right now. So I'm, confined by being a father. Once my son gets back, all bets are off. Okay, so here is a to-do service. So what does a service do? Right? We talked about what a controller does. A controller calls a service. What does a service do? Services are really where the magic truly does happen. Services are where the business logic happens. It's where it's the unique, it's what makes the application unique. Right? Most applications that have controllers, the controllers all kind of do the same thing in general. They call services and send data back to the front end. That's essentially what all controllers do across any application that you'll ever build. Okay? When it comes to repositories, what do repositories do? Well, pretty much any application you build, all a repository does is CRUD. Creating, reading, updating, and deleting data. That's kind of really all repositories do. Okay? So in general, across any application you build, a controller code and repository code is largely going to look similar. The magic and the unique code happens in the service. So that's basically how I think about it in my head. Is this just plain old controller code? Is this plain old repository code? Or is this sort of unique code that's special for this application? If the answer is it's special for this application, then it probably should be, you should consider putting it in a service. Okay, so what is this service going to do specifically? Well, we want it to grab stuff from the database. Okay, we want to load all the items from the database into the service and send it back to the controller. So let's create a method called fetch all to-do items, right? It's going to return a list of to-do items. We haven't created this yet. To-do item means nothing to my application. We still need to create it, so bear with me. But this is the method name, is fetch all to-do items. And we don't need to give it any parameters because we're just saying, give me everything. We don't need to be specific with what we want to get at this point, okay? So it's going to return a list, which is like an array. It will be an array, specifically an array list. So hopefully you know what an array is. If you don't even know what an array is at this point, this is going to be pretty over your head, but hey, by all means, stay and enjoy the tutorial. But what's happening here, the issue is it doesn't know what a to-do item is. So what is a to-do item, right? Well, that's largely going to depend on the specific application that you want to build. If I'm building a to-do list, what data do I even care about with respect to a to-do list? So this is what I'm going to put into this object. I'm going to create this object as a plain old Java object with getters and setters and fields that will store data that pertain to a specific item in my to-do list. So let me create that class, and I will put it. Typically, those go in like a domain class or domain package. Typically, domain objects are a representation or a Java object representation of a database table. Okay, hopefully, again, you know what a database table is. I can only go so far in detail here. And by the way, if you're still watching this, if you're really enjoying it, I've said it once already, but again, I must appease the YouTube algorithm gods. Please do click on the like button if so far you're liking this and you see promise in this tutorial. Please click the like button for that wonderful algorithm that we all love. Okay. Private integer. What is it? Sorry. To-do item. What data do we want to store in a to-do item? Typically, the first thing in general, speaking in general, for any objects like this, any domain object, you're going to want to have an ID. It's a unique number, like your social security number or whatever. It's something that will uniquely identify a single item in anywhere, right? The concept of an ID is very generic. So we need to have an ID. Typically, in most cases, you need to have some sort of an ID. Now, if this was a real-world application, I might use the long data type. Long is just a bigger number. It's a long stores whatever 2 to the power of like I think it's 64 in terms of bytes in size, which is I think a gigantic number. So 2 to the power of where's my power of 64? Is it that big? It's either 2 to the power of 64 or 2 to the power of 32. No. Is it 64? Okay, quick sidebar. Java long data type. Unless someone already knows it, they can paste it before I get to the answer. Where'd it go? Short 64-bit, right? So that's 2 to the power of 63 minus 1. My apologies. Because it's assigned, so it goes both ways. 2 to the power of 63 minus 1. Yeah, that number looks more like it. So a long stores 2 to the power of 63 minus 1 bytes, which is equal to that monstrosity of a number. I don't even know how big that is. That's gigantic, right? So that's overkill for this particular application, guys. So I'm going to use an integer just because it's a little bit smaller. Integer is 2 to the power of 32. So, or 2 to the power of 31 or whatever it was. 31 minus 1. So an integer goes to this size. So 2 billion. So if I'm going to have more than 2 billion to-do items, then this will be a problem if it's not a long. But anyway. I'll create as an integer. So, getting our brains going, are we? Hopefully. What else do we want to store in this to-do item? So if I was going to make track of a to-do list, what do I care about? Well, I care about things like, I guess, the description or whatever. Like, what is the task or whatever that I'm doing? I guess I could call it a task. That's probably a better name. Let's call it a task. What else do we want to store? Maybe like something like a created date, but I don't know. I don't know if I want to go into that detail. Let's just do a Boolean and let's say is done. So we can see is this thing done or not. So that's it. That's all we'll store. We will store 3 things. And what I just did there was I created getters and setters. Let me do that again because I did that quickly. You can right click in Eclipse and go to source and generate getters and setters. And then you can choose to generate getters and setters for anything. Boom. Again, if you don't know what getters and setters are, that's kind of a bit of a, entry-level concept in terms of the Java language. So unfortunately don't have time to get into that. So it just allows you to manage the data. So cool. We have a to-do item. Fantastic. So now let's get back to our concept of, remember we had our flow that we were talking about, like the front end, the request, controller, service, repository, back to service, back to controller, back to front end. That flow. We're currently at the service side. So the service side, it wants to fetch all the to-do items. How do you do that? How do you fetch to-do items? Well, you typically fetch it from a database. So we would need to create a repository. Oops, I forgot to put service in the .service package. I gotta make sure my code is good. Let me move it into the package. There. Now to-do service is in a service package. Let's also create a repository. Again, to-do repository. And let's remember to put it in a repository package. Okay. Did I also forget to annotate this? No, I didn't. It's annotated with @service, and we should also annotate it with @repository. Why we do this, why we annotate with repository and with service and with controller, is because that allows the Spring framework to manage all these objects for us. And I'll show you why that's important in just a moment. So what should the repository do? Well, we want to be able to fetch fetch stuff, right? We want to be able to fetch all the to-do items. Fetch all to-do items. How do we get all of the to-do items? Well, I'm glad you asked. We will, for now, again, normally we'd actually interact with a database here. That's the whole point of a repository, is to interact with a database. We're just going to store this as a list up here. So we're going to have an instance variable, I should make it private, instance variable that will store all of our data. Again, this is the one part of this that is not this is not production ready, okay? Because we're not talking to a database here. This is essentially a database that's going to live in the server's memory. So if we reboot the web server, we're going to lose all of our data. That would be catastrophic in the real world, unless that was like a cache. You could essentially think of this as like a cache, sort of, because we're just storing everything in memory. So that's my one caveat in terms of the building of this quote-unquote production-ready application. We'll call it to-do items equals new array list of items. Control-Shift-O to import all of the types that come in up here. Cool. So all the fetch all to-do items method is going to return to-do items. That's it. It's just going to return to-do items. Simple as that. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. So we, therefore, with the repository done, well, done for now, returning the to-do items list, the service then, what should it do? Well, the service, again, if you go back to my little diagram here, the service should call the repository, and the repository will return the data back to the service. So we've done the repository that returns data back to wherever it's called from. So that means we need to call the repository from the service. How do we call that repository? Well, as promised, I'm going to talk about why we are using the @repository and @service and @REST controller annotations. All of these things, if you click on REST controller, implements controller, this extends from a component. @component is something special in the world of Spring. Let's check out service. We click on @service. It is, oh look, it's also a component. If you go to the repository and click on the repository, oh look, it's also a component. So these three different annotations all essentially extend from the concept of a component. Components are essentially little flags that Spring uses to manage your objects for you. In other words, you don't have to instantiate these things. Spring will instantiate them for you and manage their life cycle. A component by default is a singleton. These are fairly advanced concepts. Singleton just means it's going to instantiate it once and only once. It's going to have one instance of it that exists throughout the entire application at any given moment. It will never create more than one instance of that object. Okay? So there's some importance to that statement, but again, hey, maybe you should join one of my boot camps. coderscampus.com/bootcamp to apply now. I'm running a boot camp soon in early November. So if you are someone who is ready to rock and you're loving this stuff and you want to do more than click the like button and you want to actually get a full education for 6 months with a job guarantee, coderscampus.com/bootcamp. coderscampus.com/bootcamp. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. Okay, so fetch all to-do items is in the service. So how do we get this service to do stuff? We want it to actually interact with the repository. Well, like I said, the repository is a component. I talked about it, the @repository, uses a component. That's what the repository interface, or annotation uses. It's a component. So because it's a component, we can do something special inside of the service. We can say private to-do repository, to-do repo, I'll call it. We can Control-Shift-O, so import it in. And we haven't instantiated this object. This is an object, it's a field, it's a whatever instance variable you want to call it. But we haven't instantiated it because we can use this magical thing, this magical annotation called auto-wired. Okay? I kind of like the word inject better, but it's not inject, it's called auto-wired. But that's what it's doing. It's injecting the to-do repository, the instantiated component, the instantiated to-do repository. It's plugging it into this service so that you can actually use it. So when I say to-do repo over here and hit, I'm starting to sound like Kermit the Frog now, and hit period, the dot notation, we can actually, invoke the fetch all to-do items, right? Which is a method that we created already in the to-do repository, which is right here, fetch all to-do items. It just returns the to-do items that were instantiated here. So, we can grab those and we can return those to our front end. Well, almost. We can return those to our controller. Again, controller calls service, calls repository, which returns data back to the service, which returns data back to controller. So the service here is returning the data from the repository back to the controller. It seems like a lot of unnecessary excess code just to do that, but it's a good design pattern. It's a good convention to follow, because this makes your code very scalable and allows for plenty of growth. So I'm gonna have to take a pee break soon. I've been drinking a lot of water. So we have the REST controller now. We're back here. Haven't done a request yet. We will. We go to controller, service, repository, back to service, back to controller. Here we are back in the controller, and we want to be able to return our stuff. Well, hold on. Sorry, we haven't even called the service yet. Pause. We need to call the service from the controller first. How do we do that? Same concept like we did in the service. We do a to-do service this time. Instead of in the service, we had done the to-do repository and auto-wired it in. This time we're going to create a to-do service inside of the controller and auto-wire that guy in. Okay? That way we can do to-do service inside of this endpoint and say dot find or fetch all to-do items. And we can have those stored as a list. To-do items is what we'll call it. Cool? So we have this list of to-do items that we have, hypothetically speaking, fetched from the database. Now what do we do with them? Remember when I promised I was going to talk about response entity and what that means? Well, response entity is something that comes from Spring, and it allows us to essentially easily send data in JSON format to our views, to our front ends, to our client side. How we do that is we just do this: return response entity dot. And we have all these different things that we can do. We can have it return a specific status, an HTTP status. You might be asking, what's an HTTP status? Well, if you've ever seen the word 404 not found on a page when you went to navigate to it, or 500 error or something like that, those codes, 404, 500, 400, 200, these are HTTP status codes. What they mean are they give us clues as to what happened in the life cycle of this whole process when you do an HTTP request. So if you try to get something or post something or put or delete or whatever, there's usually a code that goes along with it that gives us a hint as to, typically a really good hint as to, was it successful? Was it not successful? Was it redirected? Was there an internal error? Was there some sort of bad request situation? All that stuff can be conveyed through an HTTP status. Okay, so if I want to build this out in a normal way, well, semi-normal way, there's a shortcut here. I'm going to show you the long way and then show you a shortcut. You can say return response entity dot status, HTTP status dot OK. OK is the 200 code, meaning everything's okay. Okay, so you declare a status, but you don't just want to return a status, you also want to include a body. And the body that you want to return is the data, the body, the data that's going back. The data we want to return is our list of to-do items. That's how we do it. We return a response entity with a status that has a body back to the calling code. Okay, but there's a slightly better way, and by better I mean quicker way to do this. The concept of doing a dot status, HTTP status OK dot body is very common. So instead of typing all that, you can just type dot OK. And that's the same thing. So you see, it's a lot easier to write than all of that, right? Programmers are lazy people. We don't like to do excess typing, and if we type the same thing over and over again, someone's going to make a shortcut out of it. So there you go. There's your shortcut. All right. Whew, how long have we been going for? 40 minutes. I'm going to have to do some stretches and stuff. So that's the start of our Java application. For the sake of brevity, is that the right word? For the sake of keeping things quick here, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say if to do items dot size is 0. I'm going to manually inject some to do items. I'm going to say to do item item 1 equals new to do item like this. Okay, and I'm going to say item 1 dot set. I'm going to create an item. I'm going to say set is done false, because if you create a new to do item, then yeah, generally it's false. And the task will be, task number 1 will be the default name for it. And I'm also going to keep track of I have to do this because I'm not using a database server. I'm going to have to keep track of IDs. So, ID counter equals 0. So then what I can do here is say item1 dot set ID, and I can set it to the value of ID counter. And what I can do here is actually do a little plus plus at the beginning. If you guys have ever seen that before, some people have, some people haven't. If you have seen this, you've probably done some sort of university stuff. If you've never seen this before, then, well, welcome to this notation. What this means is this will... actually, hold on. Do I want to do that? Maybe I don't. Maybe I want to do it the other way around. Do I want to do it like that? Plus plus? You've probably seen plus plus at the end. Let's do that, and then we'll see. If you do plus plus at the end, it will increment the value and return the new value that's been incremented. So in other words, it'll say 0 and count it up by 1. So it'll turn 0 into 1, and then return the value of 1 into the setter method. So we'll set the ID to be 1. If you want to return the value first and then increment it after, you can do this. You put the plus plus in front. In other words, this will return the value 0 to the setter method and then increment it. But anyway, we'll do plus plus at the end because I want the first ID to be 1, not 0, but whatever. It doesn't really matter ultimately. So we do that. We create a to-do item, but then we need to put it into our list because remember, we are returning the list, which is still empty at this point. We just instantiated an item. We haven't put it into our array list. So now we need to say to-do items dot add item 1. Right? So now the to-do items array list has one thing in it. We'll start with just one thing. Okay. Whew. Now we can go to the front end. Back to dark mode. By the way, you can install dark mode in Eclipse. I have it for another project. I should have installed it here. It's so much nicer on your eyes when you're in dark mode. So, okay. Back to front end. How are we going to do this? How do we create a front end that does what we want it to do? We can have the app. Remember we had hi there. Where is it? Right here. Our React app just says hi there right now. What we want it to do is we want it to grab the data from the database. We want it to load in all of the items, the to-do items. So before we return the quote-unquote HTML code, we can add functionality. We can add functions. We can code, right? We can do some code here. So what I want to do is I want to, when I load the page, fetch data. So there's a way to do that in React called, these are called hooks. Hooks allow us to, how would I describe this? Well, I can describe it with an example. UseEffect is a hook. And UseEffect is essentially, it's just a method. It's a function that you can call. Okay, so it's a function like this. Look at this. It's an imperative function that can return a cleanup function, accepts a function that contains imperative. This is awful. I hate, anyway. What UseEffect does is it allows you to do something on load and on destroy, essentially. So when the app loads up, you can have it do something. And when you're leaving the page, it can do something as well when it's sort of closing down that particular page or that view. And also, it can do stuff in between too. It can listen to, just like controllers will listen to certain endpoints and execute when requests come in, certain requests come in. The same concept was it's the same concept that useEffect does, which is it can listen for changes to objects. So if the object changes and becomes a new object, like if a new object is inside into it, it'll re-execute that useEffect hook. That's why it's called a hook. Kind of like a web hook. Web hooks are like event based. When an event happens, it fires some code. Okay, that's the same thing as useEffect. When an event happens, it fires and executes the code inside of it. Well, what code is it executing? Well, we're taking in a function inside of here, right? It accepts a function. But if you've ever seen, hopefully you have seen the ES6, I think it's ES6, published a long time ago. There's a slightly different syntax for declaring functions, and it looks like this. Arrow function, like that. So it's slightly less typing, and programmers love to type less, like I said before. Fewer keystrokes equals happier programmers. So this is the same thing as having just an anonymous function. So what we do inside of this function is, essentially this represents, do something on load, right? So what do we do? What do we want to do when it loads up? Well, we can, first of all, let's put a log message here and say, hey, I've loaded up. Right, just so we can see what's going on with this useEffect hook. I keep opening the wrong thing. Let me open the console, and as you can see, hey, I've loaded up. So if I refresh, hey, I've loaded up. So it fires on load. I don't know how to describe what useEffect does other than that. So useEffect, when you use it in this way, fires on load. You can also return a function, and then this fires on unload, essentially. Now, I don't know if will it fire on unload here? No, because it's not actually unloading. Anyway, this happens rarely. This typically you want to do when you have like a listener that you fired up and you're listening to something, and then you want to unsubscribe from the listening events because you're moving to another screen. That's sort of the use case that I've seen for this. So I very infrequently use this sort of return a function piece of code here on the unload function. So I'll stick with onload. What do we want to do when we load up this app? We want to fetch the data from the database, right? How do we fetch the data from the database? Well, we use something called fetch. There's other libraries that you can use, but this is built into JavaScript. You call fetch. Fetch works by passing in a URL that you want to hit. What URL do I want to hit? I want to hit http://localhost 8080/ again, what's our code endpoint? Look at the controller. Where's the controller? Again, white screen, hurts my eyes. HTTP localhost 8080/API/to-do items is what the get mapping endpoint is listening for. Okay, so /API/to-do items. Okay, cool. That will fetch the data from the quote-unquote database. However, once we fetch the data, we want to do something with the data. How do we do something with the data once we get it? Well, there's two steps that we need to do. There's a .then. .then is, because the fetch statement, the fetch function is returns a promise. Promises in JavaScript, if you don't know them, again, I can't really go too far into detail. JavaScript is asynchronous, which means it happens whenever stuff happens. It doesn't necessarily go from top to bottom and exactly in that order, completely one line after the other. It can sort of fire and go all over the place. Fetch is asynchronous. When it's done, it'll be done when it's done. And in order to know and sort of be alerted that this fetch is completed, it's done the round trip and talk to the endpoint and receive data, you do a .then at the end of the method call. Kind of like a method chain. You're chaining a method call. This one is essentially the response data. So remember when we returned the status, the HTTP status of 200, the .ok. That's what we're looking at this point. So I like to call it response. And essentially, to give you, if you don't know the ES6 functions, this is sort of what it's returning. It's returning, I guess, response. So it's sort of like this. Right, that's what it's doing. It has a response that it's passing into a function for us that we can then do something with. okay? And we can return something, right? That's what we are allowed to do here. But there's a better way to write this out, a less verbose way. You just get rid of the function, keyword, and you add the arrow. And that's it. And actually, you could even get rid of the return as well as the brackets and just do this, response.json. So, and let me save that. So, dot then response and response.json. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the response and it's going to look at the body of the response, and .json will parse the body of the response and return it. And again, that is a promise. So you get the body of the content, the data, the list of to-do items, and again, you need to chain it into another dot then. Now you have your to-do items. Okay, and you can actually do something with them. So we can do a console log on the to-do items and actually take a look at what it is that we have. Okay. Whew. So let's have a look at our code. Connection refused. So let me do that. Let me go back. Hey, it says, hey, I've loaded up, and then get localhost 8080/API/to-do items, error, connection refused. So we got an error. Why did we get an error? Well, it couldn't talk to the server. Okay. Why couldn't it talk to the server? I forgot to boot it up. So I'm going to go here, run it again, and bring my web server up. Boom. Web server started up. So come back to our front end, refresh. Oh, okay. So this is a different error. I forgot about this. This is silly. So this is a security issue. This is a silly security thing that can be fixed in a generic and easy, not so easy way, and I don't want to get into that, but there's a quick band-aid fix that this is not how I would do this in production. So this is another red flag. This is not, the code that I'm about to write is not what I would do in production. I would handle this in a different way. But what it's saying is, if you ever see the word CORS policy, CORS is something built into a lot of browsers that will stop you if you build an application on a website. Let's say your website is, coderscampus.com, and you're building out an application that's coderscampus.com. And then coderscampus.com is trying to fetch data from, google.com and pull the data from google.com. The browser looks at that and says, that's two completely different domains. You have coderscampus.com trying to fetch data from a completely different place from within the browser. That's a bit sketch. So it will stop that from happening, and it's blocked by something called the CORS policy, which is the Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, I think is what it stands for. Cross-origin meaning two different domains. Resource sharing means just, HTTP requests. So, but I mean, hey guys, this is I have a React app, and I'm just talking to my own server. So what the heck? Why is it? But technically, they're different domains because they're different ports. It falls into that category. So what we need to do on the REST controller side is, I think we can do. There's like a CORS. What? I should have. Oh wait, it's in here. I did this already. Demo app. Let me look at the. Don't look at this code. Don't look at this code. Cross origin. That's what it is. Close this. Close this. Good thing I solved this problem once already. It's not CORS. It's cross origin. And then in here you can pass in the origin that you want to allow. In other words, or the origins if you want that you want to allow. In other words, localhost 3000. So the HTTP server, the web server on port 8080 is going to allow requests to come in from port 3000. Let's reboot. Take a big breath. Coming up to the hour mark. I was hoping that we'd be able to get further than this, but you guys are very, very quiet in the chat. I can only assume that means you are so intently focused on this video, and I'm doing such a good job teaching that there's absolutely no questions that you have. And if that's true, coderscampus.com/bootcamp. Huh? Marketing. So, let's come back here and let's refresh. Okay, the error goes away. Beautiful. There's some warnings. Don't worry about the warnings. What I want to draw your attention to is this little guy right here. Let's expand him. Ooh, what's this? It's an array of objects. specifically an array of one object. What is this object? Oh, it's an object with an ID of 0, an is done of false, and a task of tasks number 1. In other words, this is the code that came from our quote-unquote repository. In other words, we have successfully passed data from the server side into our front end. Congratulations, that's pretty cool. That's what we do. That's what we do all day as programmers. We just shuffle data around and modify it and delete it and read. We CRUD, right? Create, read, update, delete. That's all we do all day long as programmers. So it's a big deal. So what can we do with it? So now let's get into more talk of React. I want to assign this right here, where we log it to the console. And by the way, I can do this. I can say, to-do items list, and do a comma. If you, double quote. If you've ever done logging, this is a good little trick. You do the string first, a comma, and then the thing that you want to print out to the console. And in the console, it looks nicer. It says to-do items list, and then you can expand it and actually see the list. Okay. Some people do it in a different way. Some people will do this. We'll use the backtick notation, and we'll sort of quote unquote inject it into the backtick notation like this. That doesn't work so well because then you get to-do items list, and then it just says object, and you can't expand it at all. That's kind of annoying. Well, that's super annoying and not helpful at all. So it's better to do a comma and then add your to-do items. I don't need backtick notation there because I'm not injecting a variable in. So then you actually get so instead of object, you get the actual list that you can expand and look at, and it's human readable, right? Cool. So I want to do something with this list of items. I want to store this as state. So one thing that we can do in the world of React, which of course we can do this is the whole point of development and stuff, we can use state. We can store state inside of each of our views, inside of each of our components that we're building out. How do we do that? It's a little bit different than you're used to if you're used to the Java world. We use a keyword called const, which means constant. It's kind of a habit that you should get into. It's a convention where you declare something as a constant always, unless it doesn't need to be a constant, and then you sort of downgrade it to a variable that can be modified. So that the good habit to get into is everything's a constant. That way there's less mutability going on and should lead to fewer bugs. Anyway, you declare a constant variable, but actually we're going to declare this constant variable in a special way. We're going to surround it with square brackets, and we're going to call it to-do item. I'm going to call it to-do items, and set to-do items equals something called use state. There's another hook called use state. And we'll start it with what? We'll start it as... we'll initialize it as null for now. Let's see what happens. So because I have to-do items here and to-do items there, that's a bit of a naming conflict. So let's just call this, instead of to-do items, we'll just call this data. And then that way we call this data. Okay, so I'm just sort of renaming that variable there. What we can do now is when we have this data, which really represents to-do items, we can say set to-do items and pass in that data. Okay, so it's like a getter and a setter method in the world of React, which is pretty cool. I'm used to getters and setters as a Java programmer, so it's a slightly different syntax, and this is called array destructuring going on, but it's cool. It works. So let's prove that it works. Instead of having it say div and hi there, I want it to actually show the to-do items. Now, you might think you could say return to-do items and like wrap it in a div tag, right? So wrap it in a div tag and then wrap this in curly brackets to make it an object, right? You might think that would work, but what we get is we get a bunch of errors. Actually, we get a bunch of errors, and then we get a bigger error saying there's something horribly wrong, right? Why is that horribly wrong? The error above in the div component. objects are not valid as React. Okay, wait. So we can't just directly take an object and put it into a div. We need to do something different with it. I was hoping that I was going to be able to do this first and then show you a slightly different version of this. But anyway, what we can do here, we can still inject stuff into a div, but we can't just inject a full object. We need to turn that object into HTML. Well, specifically JSX, the flavor of HTML. But how do we do that? How do we take a collection, an array of objects or an array of anything and turn it into an HTML-friendly version of that object? Well, just like in the world of Java, JavaScript has the ability to use the .map function, which if you've done streams in Java, .map allows you to mess around with the object that you have that you're iterating through in a list of objects or in a collection of objects. It allows you to mess around with it and return something slightly different. So what this allows us to do is take the array of objects and go single object by single object. In other words, one to-do item object after one to-do item object. Take the object and turn it into HTML. We're going to take the JSON text and format it as HTML so that we can return that HTML onto the front end, into the view, right? So we're just transforming an object into HTML. That's what the .map allows us to do. .map is a function, and it's an anonymous function that has one parameter. You can call it whatever you like, that parameter. We'll call it a to-do item arrow function, and we can say return an object, right? I can do this. What if I just say hello in here? Can I do that? Or is it going to be angry with me? Map expects a return value. Yeah, so you have to say return in here, right? Return? Yes. Okay. So is this happy now? No. Cannot read map of null. There we go. That's the exception I was waiting to receive. Now I realize this .map and to-do item, we're not actually doing anything with it right now. I'll get there in a second. We first need to solve this problem. Cannot read property map of null. What could that possibly mean? I will tell you, of course. Up here, we initialized to-do items as null. To-do items is null. And while it's loading, this happens asynchronously. So sort of in the background, it's going to execute the use effect and it's going to try to fetch the data from the backend and blah, blah. But before this code is done, it's going to hit this code and try to do to-do items.map. If to-do items is initialized to be null, and you say null dot anything, that's going to give you essentially a null pointer exception. So that's what we're running into. So essentially we want to say, hey, don't actually try to do a dot map until to-do items has been populated with something. In other words, as long as it's not null, then I want you to do this thing. So in the world of React, we use something called a ternary operator. Ternary operator. If you don't operator. If you don't know what a ternary operator is, I can say it very quickly. It's like an if-else. Oops. If something, then do, item 1. Else, do item 2. Right? That's a typical if-else statement. But if you want to rewrite this as a ternary operator, you can say something question mark do item 1, or otherwise else do item 2. So you see how this turns into that? If something, which is kind of like if, the question mark is kind of like the if something, then do the stuff to the left of the colon, which is right here. This is the if true. If it's true, do the stuff on the left of the colon. If it's false, do the stuff on the right of the colon. That's what a ternary operator does. It allows us to write an if-else statement in one line. So let's apply that to the concept of the to-do items object array. What we can say is a shortcut of not. We can say not to do items, question mark. In other words, oh, sorry, my bad. To do items. When we do this, we're kind of saying, is to do items true? Kind of like saying, does it exist? Is this actually an object? That's something that JavaScript can do. You can just do an if statement right on a variable itself to see if it's been initialized. In the world of Java, you would have to say not equal to null, question mark, right? This concept of to do items not equal to null, question mark, is the same thing as just not having not equal to null. That's just a shortcut. So we can say to do items, question mark. So that means if we have a value, if it is not null, then go ahead and do this mapping thing. All right. Otherwise, so where do we put our otherwise? Right here. This is our colon, just like we did here. Otherwise, else, we can just return nothing. Return blank. Or we can even say return loading. Loading data. ... Right? There. Go back to our front end and look at this. It says hello. Now there's some craziness going on here. It's loading and loading and loading and reloading and reloading and reloading, and that's because I messed something up. But let's stop that. Let's close that and come back here and see why this is happening. So what's happening is we are modifying to do items, and when to do items is modified, it's actually changing. It's seeing that it's changing, and it's re-rendering the page because to do items changes. That's the whole point of React. React will react to things changing. The setter method that we did with respect to state changing, when we set new data into this to do items, this is brand new data that we're setting in, it'll cause it to re-render the screen. When the screen re-renders, this use effect says, oh, I need to be run at the beginning when the screen re-renders. So it'll re-render itself again and then fetch the data. It's going to initialize the data as null and then change the data to be new data and then re-render again. And then, oh, I need to execute on re-render. You see what's happening here. It's a constant loop. So what we need to do is, well, we can do a couple things. What should we do? Let me try to do this. Let me pass in a dependency list. Okay, what I did there was I put a comma after the function. In other words, useEffect can take two parameters. The first parameter that useEffect can take is a function. The second parameter is a list of dependencies to avoid this craziness, right? So we can depend on the to-do items list. Okay, so we can depend on that. So what that means is, and what it should happen, although I could be wrong, I am still fairly new. Yeah, I'm still wrong. Okay, we can depend on it, cool, but it's still gonna do the same thing and re-render because it's null. We initialize it as null, it's a problem. So I guess one way around this problem is to say, looking forward to seeing the end result now. If we don't have any to-do items, then fetch all the to-do items. That's what we can do. So we'll go back to localhost 3000, and hopefully that's, there we go. And this is a separate issue. So, hey, I've loaded up, fetch the array, and then it has to re-render the screen. That's why it says, hey, I've loaded up again. It re-renders the screen because that list changed, right? We changed that list because we did set to do items. But then when it came back in and said, hey, I've loaded up, this becomes false, and then it doesn't change the data anymore, and then therefore it doesn't re-render the screen. So actually the passing in of this as a dependency didn't make a difference. My bad. Yeah, you can do either one. So this becomes important later. So we have our to-do items loaded on the screen. Now, there was a problem here. There's an error saying each child in a list should have a unique key property. Well, whenever we do a .map like this and we're returning stuff from a .map, it's kind of required for you to add a key element to the thing that we are returning. So you can say key equals something. But let's back up. So as we're going through a list of to-do items and taking the object, the to-do item object, and sort of deconstructing it into an actual HTML element or elements that actually it has to be one element. We'll see that in a moment. We want to turn it into an HTML element and return that. And so let's do that. Let's break this to-do item object into an actual HTML element. So what should a to-do list look like? Well, there should be a checkbox, right? There should be an input type equals checkbox. with a, what is it, value? I never remember this. No, checked. Where checked equals something. The checked equals, normally you would say checked, or you would say not checked, or true or false or something. Checked true, checked false, I believe is how it works. So how do you make this dynamic? How do you make it react based on the data that we're getting in? Well, what you can do here is instead of just passing in a string, you can wrap your string in the object curly braces. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to write code in here. So what do we want the checked item attribute to say? We don't want it to always be set to true. We want it to be dependent on the to-do item that we are iterating through. Because remember, we're iterating through or streaming through, although streaming is a Java thing, we're streaming through a bunch of items. In other words, we can say to-do item dot, and then we need to know the property of the to-do item. The over here, to-do item, their Boolean is called isDone. So isDone is what we're looking at. So to-do item for checked equals to-do item dot isDone. Okay, save it, come back to the front end, and we have an unchecked checkbox. Okay, is that true? Let's check. I think it is true. In our repository, if you remember way back when, again, white screen, sorry for those of you who are getting used to dark mode, set is done is set to false. In other words, empty checkbox. What if we change this to be true and rebooted our server? Let's see. If I did this correctly, it will have rendered the checkbox as not a blank, but rather a checked checkbox. I would take a bow, but I mean, having just a single checked checkbox on the screen, it doesn't seem like much of an accomplishment right now. Whew, this is turning into a long video. My son still hasn't gotten back from his grandmother's house, so hey, I still have time. Let's go and do more. So, after the input checkbox, we want to have, again, if this is a real to-do app, what do we want it to look like? We want to have a checkbox for our to-do items. Then we want to have the name of the task that we're working with, right? So we can have like a span where inside of the span, we put to-do item dot task, because that's the name of the task. Now, that looks correct. That looks like it should be good. That looks like we haven't done anything strange or silly, but we're getting some sort of a linting problem. It's saying, hey, it's pointing to the span, and it's saying compiled or failed to compile. Adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a JSX fragment? ? So what's happening here is when we return a JSX piece of code, it needs to be one. It needs to be one tag. So this, you can only return one tag. In other words, all this should be wrapped in something. Typically, you might do not typically, you could do a div. So you wrap the entire thing in a div, and if I hit save, it's going to format the code. So you see what it's doing? It's returning one div, so it's returning one HTML element, one JSX element, and with two things nested inside of it, right? That's one way to solve this problem. And then look, on the front end, it says task number 1. We're getting somewhere. That's the name of the task that we have in the database. A better way to do this is instead of doing div, because div has meaning, div is a block level element and it can cause you to, unintentionally add new lines. So just delete div. That was a really, what's the word? Loud keystroke. I deleted the word div. So this is actually something that's unique to React. This empty tag followed by a sort of an empty closing tag is a shortcut. Like I said, developers like shortcuts. We don't like to type things. It's a shortcut for this, react.fragment. That's what it is a shortcut for. It's complaining because it doesn't know what fragment is, and this is actually a good example of what you can do for importing in React. If I hit Control space, you can see, React. Sorry, it should say fragment. Oh, it's not allowing me to import. Something's messed up. Anyway. What I would need to do is in here up top, when we're importing from React, you would also need to import, I think, fragment. Is that right? Or is fragment separate? No, fragment is separate. Fragment doesn't go in the curly brackets. It's here. fragment. Oh my god, I don't remember how to do that anymore. That's how long it's been. Oh man, I don't remember how to import a fragment. Oh, Trevor. Anyway, trust me, there's a way to like import this. React component? Is it React component fragment? It's not. No, that doesn't look right at all. Anyway, like I said, avoid the problem completely by just not typing in fragment at all and using that syntax. So, yeah, it is short for React.fragment, but anyway, there's clearly a lack or a block in my brain right now on how to do that. I've done it so much that it was second nature, and then I stopped using it and started using the shorthand version. Anyway, it's a shortcut for React.fragment. So what this does is it doesn't give any side effects. There are no side effects to using this as the thing that, because since it needs to have everything wrapped in one thing, again, if you use a div, it's a block level thing and it could have side effects. React fragment is just, it's like a nothing. It's like just a wrapping thing, and that's all it does. It allows your code to compile properly. So we go back to the front end and refresh, and there you go, right? It's cool. Now, let's handle this error. It's talking about each child in a list should have a unique key property. So this is the list. This is the list, but we're mapping it to a bunch of these that are coming out. So there's a bunch of fragments that are coming out. So you need to have a key. So you need to say key equals, oh shoot, can you do this? Key equals, you might need a bloody React fragment to do this. Oh no, I'm gonna have to solve this problem. I'll just need to Google it. You need to supply a key. The key needs to be unique for the page. What is a unique key for the objects that we are iterating through? Well, to-do-item.id. Remember, if you look back at the to-do item over here, we have a task, we have is done, and we have an ID. The ID is unique. So you do key equals to-do-item.id. But you can't just have an empty thing like this that messes everything up and it's confused and it doesn't know what the heck you want. This is not compiling, so you need to have a React. Can I just type fragment? There we go, auto import. Is it just fragment? It's not just fragment. That does not look right. React component, fragment from React. Is that how you can do that? Suspect. Huh. Anyway, it works, doesn't it? Refresh. Yes, it works. So the error went away. Fantastic. Okay, so I guess that's the way to do it. Again, I'm used to typing React.fragment, but there's some JavaScript reason why that the way I was doing it wasn't working. And anyway, this does. There you go. You import it from React like this with fragment in here, and there you have it. So cool. Now what? Well, we need to add some legitimate functionality. And you see there's a little warning here saying, hey, you provided a checked property to a form field without any on-change handler. This is going to render a read-only field and blah, blah, blah. So in other words, when I click the checkbox, it doesn't do anything. It's not unchecking itself. And you might be thinking, what the heck? How did I break HTML? This should uncheck. Well, we need to do exactly what it tells us. So thankfully, it gives us hints along the way. So the checkbox should have, the input type checkbox should have a change on change. So when this thing changes, and again, when I say this, what you see on the screen here, this HTML code is actually, it's handled by React first, right? React deals with it first and then sends events to the actual DOM. So that's why you can have this behavior where when you interact with what is seemingly a regular old HTML element on a DOM, on the domain object model, you would expect that it would function the way a normal checkbox should function. But it's not doing that because it's going through React first. And React is telling you, hey, you need to invoke the onChange method for this to actually work. In other words, when this state changes, so when we click on the checkbox to try to change it, you need to tell it what to do. So what do we want to do? Well, when we change the to-do item, we want to, well, we're actually getting into something completely different here. I'm realizing that we can have, well, we we can reformat our code. Again, I promised that I was going to do this in a fairly production ready state. But an hour and 20 minutes in, I'm starting to waver on that promise. No, let me do it the right way. I made you a promise. We should do it the right way. Here's what I'm going to do. Normally, you would invoke an on change. You would invoke a function, right? And you put a function up here somewhere above the return statement, and inside of the declaration of the enclosing class, but function. You'd put it between above the return and below the declaration of the function that you're working with, and you would put another function in that would do something when this item changes. But I haven't shown you the beauty of components inside of React. So let me turn this fragment that we're creating here with a checkbox that does something when you click on it, and the name of the task or the thing. Like, this fragment that we're creating is actually a to-do item component, right? A single to-do item can be extracted and extrapolated into its own component. So we can actually create one. We can go into the source folder and let's create a folder called components. So we can stuff all of our components into one place, and we can create a new file called, well, we'll call it to-do item.jsx. Okay, and we're going to create a brand new component that's a JSX component. So essentially, it's just going to return some code, some HTML type code. It's JSX, but it's like HTML. There's a shortcut key here. It comes built in. I think it comes built into VS Code, but maybe not. There's a shortcut where you can type RSC, and it creates a stateless React object or component or whatever it's called. You click on it, and it does this. It imports React from React. It creates a constant, it's essentially a function, and it returns a div, and it exports default itself. So it's just a little helper method to get up and running with a new component. So this component is essentially, more or less, this code right here. So we can actually take this, cut it out, and paste it into where the return statement is. We can paste it in here. Okay, so, and then what happens over here is we no longer need a key here. The key is only for when you are iterating over something. The iteration happens outside of here. It happens because we're doing the .map. So we don't need a key, which means we don't actually have to type the word fragment. Okay, we can go back to that shortcut. Okay. Instead, back over here, when we're returning something in the .map where that code used to exist, now we can just inject the component, the to-do item component. Okay, so it's gonna return a full component object type thing, which is just this guy over here. Okay, so let me get rid of the on change for now and save this just to show you. Oh shoot, right. Okay, this does get a bit more complex. I'm sorry. So previously I was saying, hey, grab the data from to-do item, and to-do item was part of the map of to-do items that we were iterating through here. But let me think about this. We want to pass that data in. That's what we want to do. So you can pass data in to the component that you're creating. And what we can do is we can pass in the to-do item data itself. We can call it, we can call it something. We can say it's an attribute. You treat it like an attribute. You can call it, let's call it data equals to-do item. Boom. Okay. So data is going to be the attribute that is passed into the properties of to-do item, the JSX file over here. How do we get access to that? How do we get access to this data that we're passing in, which is the actual object itself? You type in the beautiful words props. Props up here allows you to pass and get access to the data that you passed in over here. Specifically, it's called props. We can do a props.data to get that out, right? So technically you could say, hopefully this works. This is not good code, but let me just do this. Props.data.isDone, props.data.task. Save this, come back here. To do item is not defined. There we go, task 1. So we're back to having this here. Again, it doesn't work. We can't click on the checkbox, but we're back to having semi-functional code. However, it's complaining about the key thing again. The key prop is missing. That's because we were, again, map, returning an object. We're not providing a key, but now we can say key equals to do item dot ID. So it becomes a little bit nicer. We don't have to do that whole fragment thing that we had to do before. That was annoying. So that's, yeah. So that gets rid of that key problem. Should get rid of the key problem. There we go. But now we don't have, so now we go back to the original problem, which is we should have a checked property defined in here, an on change. So for the input type checkbox, we could say on change, do something. Now this is better. Now our functions that we're going to do, the on change, the function that we're going to create that will be executed when we change the checkbox is going to be encapsulated inside of to do item, the functional component that we've created here. We're separating our concerns. We're keeping, things together nicely. So this is just a better way to code. Component based. You create components. So what do we want to do when the checkbox state changes from checked to not checked or vice versa? What do we want to do? Well, we want to sort of update the data that is backing this entire component that we're passing in from the front end, right? So we can do something. We can do the state thing that we had before. Remember when we had state over here? We used state for the to-do items. We can do the same thing here. We can say const. Then we have the getter and setter, to-do item, and set to-do item equals use state is a function that we can import here. If I click on this, it's going to auto import. Bloop. So that it comes in over here now. See how use state comes in. And then inside of the use state brackets or parentheses, this is the sort of the default value that is going to be set into here when it loads up. The default value is props.data. Why props.data? Well, remember we passed in over here when we instantiated, quote unquote instantiated, that's the word I'm going to use because I'm a Java guy. When we're quote unquote instantiating this to do item, we passed it in right here, data. That's passed in as part of the props. So props.data, the value is going to be the actual to-do item, individual to-do item data. And now I can say, hey, on change, we can mess around with the to-do item data. Okay? There's two ways to do it. I'll do it the more verbose way first so that you guys see what's going on. And then we'll do it the less verbose way. We'll create a function. And this function will be called update is done. And what it's going to do is it's going to say what? It's going to say to do, well, you'd want to do this. To do item dot is done. This is what you might think is equal to the inverse of it, right? So in other words, when you click on it like that, passing in that, so we pass the function into on change. We do not invoke the function. That's a common mistake. That's a gotcha. Do not invoke. This is an invoking statement. We're saying, hey, we want to invoke this. No, not good. We want to pass it the function. Okay. So when we click on the checkbox, we want to call the update is done. But this actually doesn't work. At least it shouldn't work. So if I refresh and check this, it's still not working, and you might be frustrated, and you might want to flip your computer and your desk around. How long are we going? An hour and a half. Okay. I'm so sorry, guys. I thought I could go through this a lot quicker. So, in the world of React, this is a no-no. We do not update the quote-unquote getter, because this is kind of like the getter. This is what we use to read data. This is not what we use to write the data. It would be like trying to mess around with the data inside of a getter and change it inside of a getter. That's a no-no. We don't do that. So instead, we go through the setter method. The setter is what we use to update the data, to change the data. So we want to do set to do item. But there's a problem. I don't know if you can see the problem. I'm sure you'll see it once I start talking about it. Set to do item expects an entire to do item. It expects an entire object. But what we're doing is we're modifying a property of the object. We want to change is done. We don't want to change the to do item. So how do we do that? How do we have a setter method that takes the entire object, change a property of the object? Well, there's a fancy pants way to do this. This is called object destructuring. Okay. What this does, I'll delete this. What this does is equivalent to this. And the best way I can explain it is to just show you. It does this. ID is equal to ID. Is done is equal to is done. And what you call it? Task is equal to task, essentially. Right? So the key of ID is equal to that. The key of is done, the key of task, and that's sort of what it does. It will reset itself and all of its properties into here, right? This destructures the object kind of like this, sort of. And there's a bunch of errors because this is not proper syntax, but anyway, these two things are equivalent. And what you could do with object destructuring like this is something fancy. So that's sort of what it's doing, is breaking it down into its individual things. But then you can also do this. You can override, you can put a comma, and you can override is done. Because that's what we want to do. We want to update is done to be not is done. Hold on. Is done, not is done. Why is this complaining? Is done is not defined. To do item, or sorry. To do item dot is done. There we go. My bad. Is done is the key. The value, it didn't know what is done was because we need to pull it from there. So that's how we do it. That's how we can, that's the fancy pants way and the React way of modifying a property of an object when you only have the setter for the entire object. So cross your fingers that this is going to work. I don't know if I need to do more, but click the checkbox. No, I'm missing something. Hold on. Update is done. Input type checked. Oh, here. So the value of checked is pointing to props.data. I forgot to change this. Remember I said this is not production code. Props.data, you should only do that up here. And the reason why is this is what we use to just initialize it. This is not what's going to keep track of the state. And state is what React is all about. It reacts to state changes. We're passing this data in to initialize the state. This to-do item represents the current state. So we're reading from the initial value, not from the state that's changing right now. Props.data is the initial value, not the state that's changing. The state that's changing is to-do item, right here. This is the getter method for the state that is changing. Okay, let me get rid of this. This is just noise. Well, actually it's not. Well, whatever. And same down here, props.data.task. We don't want to do that. We want to read from the getter method, essentially. The single source of truth is what they call it. Oh my goodness, guys. Okay, so let's refresh. Let's click on the darn checkbox. And now it's not checked anymore. I know this seems like such an inconsequential thing that took us so long to get to. I promise you can be fast with React and with the world of Spring Boot. It's painful right now because I need to really slow down and explain everything that I'm doing as I'm doing it. Once you've done this a lot, this becomes much, much faster. So, this isn't even the great way of doing it, right? This is the longer way of doing it. This is the quicker way to do, well, not quicker, but the less verbose way to do it is, since all we're doing in here, the set to do item, and just changing the one thing in here. That's all we're doing is one line of code. You can actually put this all within the on change. Maybe that's bad form. I don't know. I don't mind it if you put it inside of here, but it gives me the excuse to show you a different syntax for how you would pass data into this function. Because remember, on change, you do this. As soon as I put in this, you're invoking the function. Remember, I said that's a no-no. You don't want to do that. You don't want to invoke the function. So then how do you do this, right? Because you want to do this and paste this in here and then get rid of this whole update is done thing, right? Technically, you want to get rid of it. Well, what you can do is you can do this. You can pass it the idea of the function. Oh, am I messing everything up? Hold on. Let me think. This is does it need to return that? Return, and then this is the set. Oh, set to do item, right? Set to do item. Boom. There. I don't know. It depends on the person, and I don't think we need this return statement. I can get rid of this return statement and then get rid of this, I think, and then get rid of this. There. That's a little bit nicer. So I did a lot there. We're just encapsulating, or not encapsulating. We're putting everything in essentially inline right here, which I find is less typing. And anyway, to each his own. Either way, I guess will work. It's just less noise up here. I don't know. I just like it that way. So just to prove to you that it still works, let me refresh. When I refresh, it's pulling the data from the server side, so it's going to recheck the checkbox. That's why it changed back to. Why don't I zoom in? Oops. There. Yeah, so it still works. I can check it, uncheck it. And that's when I check it, uncheck it, it's updating the state of the actual to-do item, which we're going to leverage right now with a use effect hook. Okay, we're going to add a hook in here, whoops, which is just, oh, come on, man, passing in a function. And we're going to react based on to-do item changing. And we're going to put in a log here for now to say, hey, the to-do item just changed. And you can pass in to-do item to see that it's changing. So the first thing you see is, hey, the to-do item just changed, which is true because it got set. It went from null to something, right? Or not null, but it was essentially nothing and it became something, so it changed. If I check again, boom, look, hey, the to-do item just changed. And you see is done as false. True, false, true, false, true, false, check, 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 check. So we can actually have a hook in here to be notified when the to-do item changes, which is a beautiful thing because this is kind of what I want to do when the state changes for my to-do item. I want to notify my server and update the data in the server. This is, I think, the last thing I can do here in this video. It's getting to be almost 2 hours. I'm going to put in a statement that I can use to call the server and update the data. Again, I want to do a whole lot more here, but hey, you're starting to get the gist of what's going on. I'll have to do a follow-up video after this. So, how do we talk to the server? Well, we've done it already over here. When we did a fetch, we're talking to the server. So fetch is our friend. How do we do that over here? Well, we do the same thing. Fetch to the endpoint. What is the endpoint? http://localhost 8080/API/to-do items? Yeah, /to-do items. However, in the world of the web, in general, when we are updating an object, typically you need two things. You need the ID of the object so that you can use that to update it. And it's typically sent as a put, okay? Or a post, it could be a post too, but post or put, we'll do a put. So we need to pass in the ID. How do we pass in the ID? Well, we're using these fancy backtick notation, which is a string, but it's a fancy string because you can inject, without string concatenation, you can inject a dynamic value, like to-do item.id. So we take the ID of the to-do item and throw it into this fetch call. However, this is going to do a get right now. By default, fetch does a get request. I just said we want to do a put request. So how do we do a put? We put a comma and then pass in a second parameter that the fetch method function takes. So it takes an object, The object, you can define a method. A method can be get, again, by default it's get, post, put, delete, or any other, options or whatever it is that you want to do, right? Put is the method we want to do right now to say, hey, let's update it. Ooh, that was loud. Now, let me close my WhatsApp here because it was noisy. Now, we want to, that will send the data to the server, but there is no data right now. There is no body to this put method. The put method needs a body if it's going to work. So we also need to define a body, which is the actual data that we're sending along to the server side. What data do we want to send along? Well, we want to send the to-do item, right? We want to send it we just updated it. This useEffect hook gets called when the to-do item changes. That's why we put this in. The to-do item is a dependency. So when the to-do item changes, it's going to call this useEffect method. And hey, if the to-do item changes, it means the state changed. And if the state changed, you want to tell the server about it so that we can update the database, etc., etc. So there's this really cool hook effect, this React effect that dovetails nicely with CRUD, creating, reading, updating, deleting data. So if the state changes, tell the server, right? So the only caveat here, the only curveball is we can't do this in the body. This itself is an actual object. You can't send an object. Again, the universal language of the internet is JSON. So we can't send an object because an object is not in JSON format. It's not a JavaScript object notation string. We need to turn this into a JSON string. How do we do that? We can say JSON, capital JSON, dot stringify. So we stringify the to-do item. So you just need to remember that one little thing for getting the job done. Whew. Let's get rid of the log for now. So this is going to execute a put call to the server, but we haven't done anything on the server side. So what we're going to get is this error, right? It's going to say, access to whatever. Well, it's blocked by the course policy because I guess we didn't. Really, this endpoint doesn't exist. So this error message is slightly misleading. Because actually the endpoint just doesn't exist. So we need to go to our horrible light theme here and add it to the controller. We're going to wrap up here, guys. We're getting to the last, hopefully no more than 15 minutes. So let's create an endpoint. So we have an endpoint for a get mapping, API to do items, but we also want to do one for a put mapping because that's what we're doing. We're putting this data. We're updating it. /API /to-do items /the ID. How do we reference or how do we say that we're passing in an ID here? We use just the curly brackets, no $sign in front of it. That's just the way it is with this notation. Just curly brackets. You can put whatever you want in here. It's essentially a variable name. We'll say ID. Cool. So that defines, the details of the endpoint. But now we essentially need to do more or less the same thing that we have up here. I'm going to copy paste and rename this to not fetch all to-do items, but update to-do item. And in the parameter list, we can actually pull this guy out and turn it into a variable that will be automatically populated with the actual ID that we're passing in. Because in the front end, over here, you see the endpoint that we're calling is localhost 8080 /API /to-do items /0. I don't know if you can see that if you're on a phone. Let me zoom in a little. /0. So 0 is what we want to grab and become a variable that we can access. How do we do that? We inject it in here. We do integer ID. Except we need to add a little bit of sugar here. This is called the path variable. So we annotate it with path variable. Okay, that's what will make this dynamic and actually inject that number 0 that we're passing as part of the request endpoint. It will actually inject it in here and we can do something with it. Okay, let me import my put mapping from Spring Framework so that it goes away, that error message. Cool. Now, we don't want to fetch all of the to-do items in here. And this is where, again, we dovetail or we talk to our, remember, controllers talk to services, which talk to repositories, which pass data back to services, which pass data back to controllers, which pass data back to the front end. So, call the server, get the data back from server, send it back to front end. Okay, call the server. Service. My apologies, that was confusing. I said server, I meant service. We're calling services, not servers. We have a to-do service, and this can do something, right? So we don't have a method there. We'll call it update to-do item, and we'll pass in the ID that we're updating. Or rather, sorry, hold on. Oh, sorry guys. My brain, I had a brain fart there. There's something critical that I'm missing with this put mapping, and that is the whole body of the actual thing. So over here, we're not just sending a URL and that's it. We're actually sending a body. So we need to take that body from the request, that's the put request, and we need to transform that body into a Java object. So we need one more variable here, one more path, or rather, this will be a request body because it's part of the request body. So we annotate it with @request body because it's part of the request body. And then we can actually inject it right into the Java object, which is really nice. The to-do item is the name of the class that represents that Java item. We can call it whatever we want. You can call it, usually you call it just body, but you could call it, you know, to-do item itself or whatever. It's coming from the front end. It will automatically be injected into this object because of the request body, which comes from Spring Framework. Okay. In which case, we don't technically need to pass in the ID because that ID is already going to be in the to-do item. But anyway, we could pass in the ID. And we could pass in the item, to-do item, to this new service method that I'm about to create. So we'll create the method. In here, I just did it quickly because I need to speed things up. In here, we have to update the database. How do we update the database? Well, there's a few ways to do it, but what I'll do is I will just say to-do repo.fetch all items. Then I will then I will stream it because it's items is a list. I can stream a list. I can filter a list based on, so each of these are, you know, individual item, and I can filter it based on item.getID.equals ID. ID is what we're passing in here. We're saying, hey, I want to update this to-do item ID with this data. So we're going to filter by that ID. Syntax error. All right. Filter it and then find it. So give me the thing that I want. Assign this to an optional, because find any returns an optional wrapper around the to-do item. I don't want to get into what that is. I'm going to call it to-do OPT. Tab this over a bit to make it slightly better syntactically speaking. Line it up. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to say if to-do OPT is present, because that's what optional does, is we can check and see if it's present. Then we can update it. If we actually have that in the list of data, we can say to-do opt.get, which will actually get the item out of the optional wrapper. Okay. Again, I'm sorry, I'm going fast. This is, yeah. We'll call this the item because we already have to-do item coming in here. And what we can say is we want to update this. So we want to say, hey, grab me the existing to-do item. And, well, do we want to do that? Why don't we just replace it? Can we just replace it? Is there an easy way to do that instead of updating all of its properties? Oh, let me think. Is there an easy way to do that? We'd have to remove it and then add it back into the list, but that would reorder it. Whatever. We'll just say this. We'll say item. This isn't the most efficient way to do this, and I'm sorry, guys, but anyway. We'll set is done to be to-do item dot get is done. Remember, to-do item is what we passed in from the front end. This to-do item here represents our actual front end data. And we can say item.set task is equal to-do item.get task. So in other words, we're taking what's in the array already. We're finding it in the array. We're taking what's in the array. We're injecting into this data that's in the array, we're overwriting all of its data with what we got from the front end, and then that's essentially it. Then what we can do is we can say return that item back. Okay, so this can return to do item. Okay, and if we never got an item here, then we can just say return null or something. You don't usually want to return null. Maybe we can say return new. Whatever. We'll just say return null. I'm just losing my... Anyway. The reason why I'm speeding up now is I think my son is on the way now, and I have something that I need to do for my wife before he gets here. And she's going to be quite upset if I don't do it for her. So that's life. So we've got the... we updated the item. And now... we can return it, right? We've got this data back, so the service, the method update to do item from the service, updates the item and returns it back. So this is essentially our updated to do item, right? This is calling a service and getting the data back, and then we can send it. We can say return, just like we did up here. We return a response entity saying okay. And instead of returning to-do items, we're going to return the updated to-do item back. In other words, get it from the front end, modify it in the back end, send the modified version back to the front end. Okay? So now in the front end, over here, back to our nice dark theme, when we're putting the data into the to-do item, we can do the .then stuff. We have to parse the response into a JSON format, because the response is going to have a status and this and that, as well as a body. Well, we want to get the body from it. That's what that line does. And then we want to take, essentially, the response body, which I just call data, because I'm lazy. And we want to do something with that data. What we want to do is we want to say set, because remember, the data that we get back is the to-do item, the updated to-do item. So we want to say set to-do item, which is the setter method, which is how we modify data. Remember, we don't use this. This is like the getter. This is the setter over here. We want to set the to-do item to be the data that was returned from the server side. Okay? So, let's see. Let's refresh. It's still saying... Why would it be blocked by the CORS policy? Is the server running? The server's running. I probably need to reboot it. That's the problem. I forgot to reboot the server. Which is, it's helpful to have, there's a plugin or an extra thing you can, I forget what it's called, it's Spring Boot Reloader or something. I forgot to do that at the very beginning when we were doing Spring Boot stuff. There's a reloader that will automatically reboot your server for you so that you never have to worry about it. I forgot to include that. There we go. Now we're getting different. Oh, look at that. Undefined is being sent in. I broke everything. Something's horribly, horribly wrong. So 415 means the method not found, right? Method not supported. The put was not supported. So put mapping, but we do have a put mapping there. I've rebooted the server. Don't start giving me weird errors now, man. I don't have time for weird errors. Good Lord, look how fast it's doing the puts. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to see I loaded up. Here's my list. A component is changing and controlled with a... Okay. Okay, what have I done? Use effect. So I'm doing a fetch. Oh, right. Oh, this is a curveball. So when we're doing a put and we're sending data as JSON, a JSON string, by default, fetch does not use application JSON as the header content type. So we actually have to override the headers and pass in custom headers. The content type needs to be application JSON. That's a tricky one. I've hit that one many times. Let's there we go. So what I usually do here, just for the sake, I'll say this, I won't do it. I usually create a helper, like a utility method, that automatically populates my headers for me. So I create like it's kind of like a get method to get my headers. So I extract this out into a get call, and then a getter method, and I just say get headers, and it populates it for me. Anyway, let's check the box. Boom. Oh, look at that. On, off, on, off, on, off. That's weird. And that's going, is that hitting my server side? Hold on. Check. Whoa. Okay, it's doing, let me stop my server. So, it's failing. What? It said it was failing. Oh, it's failed because I turned off the server. So it just kept, it was in an endless loop, right? It kept doing puts, and because it was doing the puts, it was flipping the bit back and forth. So hold on. This happens a lot when it comes to React, because React reacts to changes. Things can get wonky. So let's see. Why are we wonky? So we're changing... Oh, right. Okay. Beautiful. So there's one more thing that you need to do to avoid what you just saw happen. It keeps refreshing the thing, right? It keeps executing this fetch statement and changing the object and changing it. And when it changes, it re-executes this method. And if it changes, it re-executes. So what I usually do is I inject one more thing, one more state, and I call it is dirty. So whenever we have like a domain object type situation, I usually check to see whether or not it's dirty. So I start with the dirty being false. Dirty means has it been modified? So I start with being false. And this I say, if it's dirty, meaning it's been changed, then and only then should you actually execute the fetch and change the data. Okay? And because we're passing is dirty in here, it also needs to be dependent on is dirty, because that's a variable. It can change, so it needs to be dependent on it. And then when we click on change, in other words, when we're actually making it dirty, I'm going to add curly brackets to surround this. Did that work? That doesn't look like it worked. Curly brackets. There we go. Set. Oh, hold on. I changed it. That. I need to wrap all of this in curly brackets. Okay. Because I need to do something before I execute the setter method. I'm going to say set dirty to be true. So you see what I do? Right before I change the to-do item, change the backing object, which will then invoke this use effect, I first set dirty to be true. When I set dirty to be true, then it goes in here and executes the fetch. And then before I set the to-do item, I say set dirty to be false. That should stop the crazy back and forth madness. There. Oh, wait, hold on. Loading. Did I stop my server? I stopped my server. Okay, I see the finish line, ladies and gentlemen. Let's do this. Refresh. There it is. Uncheck. Beautiful. So, how can I prove that this is actually unchecked? When I refresh the page now, it remains unchecked. If I check it back again and refresh, it remains checked. Oh, good Lord. So, and now I see my son is pulling up. So, well, my his grandmother is pulling up. So now I need to go. I wanted to also make this configurable here so you can change the name of the task. I'm so sorry. All we got done is a checkbox. That makes me want to use foul language. But hey, we've hopefully learned a lot here. I know it looks like a lot of code to do something simple like check a checkbox. But there's a lot built into this now that we can expand upon and add a lot more functionality very quickly. So I'll leave the code base as it is. And in hopefully relatively near future, I will record another one of these and finish this app off. There shouldn't be much more left. There's maybe another, I'm going to guess 20 minutes left. But I gotta go. So thank you so much for joining. If you enjoyed this stream, by all means, check out the boot camp that I have launching in early November. If your goal is to become a programmer who gets paid, in other words, you want to land a job as a programmer and you have some experience as a coder, you're not brand new, but you have some experience, you understand a little bit about variables and for loops and while loops, that kind of thing. You have some preliminary coding knowledge. You might want to consider the boot camp. It's not cheap. It starts at, boot camps are usually $10,000, $15,000. This one is at five. I've discounted it because of COVID, so it's 5,000 USD. But there's a payment plan as well. But basically, I guarantee you a job. If you get through, you graduate, which means you do the work, you do the assignments. You can, and I guarantee you a job. So if your goal is to get a job, I would recommend you check out coderscampus.com/bootcamp on the screen and apply. You can apply, and if you are accepted, then I will welcome you into the next cohort. I'm only taking on 10 students. I'm about half full already as of the recording of this video in late October. So I have about 5 spots left. So if you're interested, check it out. Otherwise, I will see you in the next video. And also, hey, for the YouTube algorithm, people always say smash the like button. I'm not going to say that because I already did. And subscribe. You'll see the video when it comes out next if you subscribe. So looking forward to seeing you then. Take care of yourself. Happy learning. Bye for now.